Welcome back, everyone. We need to talk about the growth of the English colonies, especially economically and culturally and religiously, during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. So we need to start out by talking about money. When we think about the economic livelihood of the colonists, it's slightly different from one area to another. In the northern colonies, New York, in particular Massachusetts Bay Colony, Connecticut, Rhode Island, a lot of small-scale manufacturing, the distilling of liquor or spirits, shipbuilding industry is also huge, and the other industries that kind of support that, barrel making, rope making, all these are key to how people are making money in the early northern colonies. In the early southern colonies, we're looking at cash crops like tobacco. We've already talked about that with Jamestown. And then we're also looking at both indigo, from which you can extract a beautiful blue dye to dye garments and what have you. Indigo and also rice become very important cash crops in the South during this time period. So why do we care about who's making money? Well, because the government of England cares about who's making money during this time period. England, after all, is the mother country, if you will, right? It's the home country that supported these first settlements along the East Coast. And so from the standpoint of the king and parliament, these colonies exist really to support the home country through a system known as mercantilism. Now, this is a system that was not unique to England. It's the same. The Spanish are treating their colonies the same way, the Dutch, the French, what have you. But essentially, it's an economic policy based around the idea that the colonies exist to extract natural resources from them. You can see the little map that I have here. Some of the resources like fish and timber, tobacco, what have you, that those sorts of things can only be sold back to the home country, and that once those raw materials reach the home country, they are then turned into manufactured goods based off these raw materials, and then those manufactured goods are sold to the colonists. Now, in this way, the home country reaps all the benefits, right? And for the colonists, theirs is kind of in a supporting role, which is something that's not going to make them very happy over time. In particular, we're going to see a lot of illegal smuggling in the colonies. We're going to see, not only farmers, but small-time manufacturers in the Northeast looking for ways to sell their products to someone other than just the home country. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that when you think about it, if the home country has the rights to everything created in the colonies, then they're not really incentivized to offer a very high price when they want to purchase some of these things from the colonies. So if you're a businessman, your goal is to sell your product to the highest bidder, right? To make the most profit so that you can continue to invest it in the business. In many cases, England is not the highest bidder. So there's a lot of selling to the Dutch or selling to the French and all these sorts of things. So much so that eventually the English government cracks down on all of this. They will pass a series of acts known as the Navigation Acts, designed to control all trade to and from the colonies. You can see some examples here requiring that certain goods like tobacco, sugar, and other semi-tropical products can only be shipped to England, or that manufacturing of certain goods in the colonies was actively discouraged if these colonial products competed a little bit too successfully with their English-made counterparts. This is all a rude awakening from the standpoint of the colonists. Right, from their standpoint, the colonists believe that this policy is deeply unfair to them. They had grown accustomed to the concept of salutary neglect, which is a phrase that we often use to refer to the first 50 years or so of English settlement in North America, whereby England, for various reasons, the home country, was kind of occupied with events back home. A little thing known as the English Civil War is not the least of the issues they're dealing with, but that they kind of neglected or not deliberately ignored, but kind of, took a hands-off policy to the colonists in the New World. And from the standpoint of the colonists, they love it You know, they love the idea of self-government. They like figuring out who they can sell to without anyone kind of cracking down and micromanaging their actions. So they become very comfortable with salutary neglect, just kind of being left to their own devices. And this change in policy with the Navigation Act starting in the 1660s is an unwelcome change from their standpoint. They consider that the home country is almost punishing them for being successful at manufacturing goods and selling them to other powers. The colonists are also upset over not just being told who they can sell to, but the fact that if you were charged with illegal smuggling, that your rights as a citizen of England, your right to a trial by jury of your peers, would be suspended in that case. And instead of going into a normal courtroom full of, your colleagues, friends and what have you, who would then judge your guilt or innocence, instead you had to appear in what became known as a vice admiralty court, in which it was just you and a judge, that judge usually being appointed by the king or the king's agents, someone who was not necessarily inclined to be favorable towards you. It was just you and a judge in one of these vice admiralty courts. And so an additional outrage surrounding the Navigation Acts is that if you're caught and you're charged with violating them, you don't even get the benefit of a trial by jury of your peers. And pretty much adding insult to injury will be King James II's decision to kind of merge together, at least administratively, merge together a bunch of formerly independent colonies, including Connecticut, Massachusetts, Plymouth, Rhode Island. You can see for yourself here. And instead of having individual governors of these colonies reporting to him, he instead is going to kind of put them together into one administrative unit known as the Dominion of New England. And he's going to have one point person, Edmund Andros. His yes man will be installed to kind of monitor what's going on in all these different colonies. The colonists are livid over this turn of events. And even the southern colonies that aren't directly affected by the Dominion of New England, they're paying attention too, because they're worried if this can happen to the northern colonies, are we next? Will we lose our independence? Will we lose our ability to have a say in our own government? And very specifically, they're also upset over some changes that Edmund Andros will introduce into these colonies. You'll see a number of protests erupt over higher taxes. Andros will end up implementing higher taxes and new fees in some cases. Town meetings will be banned. If you can think back to several lectures ago when we talked about the importance, especially in the early Puritan colonies, of town meetings in which people from the community would come together multiple times a year to meet and make decisions on their behalf. Edmund Andros now is saying, no, there's no need for these. I'm calling the shots now. This infuriates many people in the Dominion of New England. He also will begin tougher enforcement of the Navigation Acts. We've already talked about how the colonists don't want to be told who they can ship to, who they can, or even how they can trade with other entities. So he's going to enforce the Navigation Acts. And then last but certainly not least, he will start revoking land titles. People who had the family, a parcel of land in their family for several generations, now Edmund Andros is saying to them, unless you can prove you have the king's insignia on some paperwork showing that you have formal title to these lands, they don't really belong to you. You need to reapply and pay fees, of course. You need to reapply and get a formal land title granted. So this is driving people insane. To give you a feel for how angry people are, we see a petition that is crafted to the king protesting a number of the problems that the colonists have with this. If you'll notice, though, in this document, people are angry, but that they call themselves still sufficiently dutiful and loyal to our king. They're hot and bothered, but they're not ready to pick up guns yet. We're not to the Revolutionary War yet. But count this as one among a series of what I like to call kind of baby steps in that direction. They're mad enough to let the king know what's going on here, but they're not quite ready to declare open warfare. They just want these issues addressed so that they can go back to being left alone, preferably. Well, just like King James II had irritated the colonists by creating this Dominion of New England, he's going to irritate some people back home in England as well, to the point where we have what's known as the Glorious Revolution take place in 1688 and 1689, in which King James II will be thrown off of the throne, and instead it will be his daughter Mary, who is married to a Dutch nobleman by the name of William of Orange. It will be William and Mary that will be invited to come in and take over the throne of England. But before they can do that, they must sign what becomes known as the English Bill of Rights, in which they have to agree not to violate the basic rights of the people of England during this period. So with all this in mind, when news of the Glorious Revolution over in England reaches the shores here of the English colonies, the ramshackle house of cards, if you will, Dominion of New England, with Edmund Andros at its head, comes crashing down, and he is forced to flee the colonies. And at that point, the colonists are overjoyed. To them, it's back to business as usual. Get rid of the king's man. Let's restore our own colonial governors. Let's restore our own political voice. Another incredibly important event that will be taking place in the early 18th century will be the so-called Great Awakening. And this essentially is a mass spiritual revival movement, one that is marked by large-scale so-called camp meetings, open-air convocations of peoples. You'll have a number of Protestant ministers from, at that time, still relatively small Protestant sects like the Baptist or the Methodist or the Presbyterians. You're going to have them going out from village to village holding these campfire revival meetings, sometimes that would stretch on for days on end, and thousands of people are going to flock to hear these ministers. If nothing else, it's free entertainment, right? Especially along the frontier area where maybe you only get to town once or twice a year. There's no video games to play on the frontier. Let's go hear what these people are yelling and singing about here through the wood. But I do not want to minimize the importance of the Great Awakening, because what we're going to see is a flood of new converts to some of these faiths. The Baptists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians are going to be bringing in a huge harvest of souls during this time period. Part of it is initially people are drawn to the spectacle of the sermons of individuals like George Whitefield, one of the most well-known of these Great Awakening ministers. It's the spectacle of him preaching on horseback, or standing on a tree stump and holding forth for hours on end. It's part of it's that, or it's the singing and the dancing and speaking in tongues that might happen at some of these events. That's what initially brings them in. But the message is also what leads many people to convert. Whitefield, among many others, will preach that anyone is capable of salvation, regardless of their past. This is a very attractive message, and a very different message than, say, the Anglican Church had been proposing, or, say, the Puritans had been proposing. For the existing religions in the colonies, a lot of emphasis was placed on the concept of predestination. The idea that long before you were even a glint in your mother's eye, well before you even existed, in other words, that God had already predestined or predetermined who is saved and who is damned. All right, so this is a common belief among many of the colonists is that, you know what, I guess I don't really have much control over my salvation. God has already figured that out. For those who felt like maybe they weren't among the ones chosen, think about how disheartening that would have been for them. So Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards and some of these very charismatic preachers of the day are coming in and saying, no, hold up, wait a minute. Actually, you do have a say in your salvation. If you commit to living what they consider to be a godly or a righteous life, then you can change that narrative. What's also important is that Whitefield and many of these preachers will be going into Native American communities and spreading the Gospels. They will be going into slave communities and espousing the idea that everyone is equal before God in a spiritual sense, that everyone is capable of salvation. So as you might imagine, therefore, when we talk about the effects of the Great Awakening, we're going to see the spread of some of these new Protestant denominations, especially the Baptists and the Methodists, among Native American and slave populations. They like this idea that anyone is capable of salvation and that spiritually everyone is equal before God. Slave owners don't like that all that much because they're worried that this might lead to rebellion. Telling a slave that they're spiritually equal might lead the slave to want to achieve political equality and economic equality, but nonetheless, we do see that as one of the big effects. It also will lead to the founding of a number of institutions of higher learning. The University of North Carolina, for instance, was originally a Presbyterian effort. The University of Pennsylvania, George Whitefield, will help to establish that school. And then, perhaps most importantly, it will break down sectional and denominational differences among the colonists, bringing them together in this mass event and kind of lessening their sense of difference between themselves and other colonists.